Today I want to show you 5 techniques that put a fresh spin on the haunting, lo-fi sounds of burial. From drunken drums and textures through to bass and mixing, these tips will help your electronic music move and breathe. By the end, you'll be able to take inspiration from burial and twist it into something that's your own in any style or genre. So to explore these ideas in an actual track, I wanted to nod to burial's haunting textured side, but then put my own spin on it with more driving dance floor elements. So first, let's look at vocals. This is the raw vocal I started with.
Let you get to me once now, baby.
Burial tracks like Archangel and Near Dark have these ghostly pitched down vocals. So here I've pitched the vocal down by over an octave. Next, here's my 4-step processing chain for cavernous, atmospheric vocals. Now I think we can agree that Burial probably didn't use a chain like this, but it's inspired by his kind of sound. So the 4 effects are, we've got a reverb with quite a long decay, then we've got a bit crusher, after that is an auto filter, that's just a low pass filter set around 1 to 2k, and then after that we've got OTT to pull everything up. So what's interesting about this is that the reduced sample rate coming after the reverb tail, that takes the long decaying reverb tail and then it turns it into this kind of decaying crispiness that sounds really nice. And then afterwards we've got this auto filter, and that's making it sound a lot more swampy and murky because it's taking out the harshness from the highs. So don't turn this filter off because it will make your ears bleed. So that's how to do it with stock plugins, but you can experiment with slightly quirkier plugins. So here I've got this Raum reverb, and that's feeding into this RX 950 with the audio bandwidth right down. And then again I've got OTT. Now, because this plugin is emulating the converters of an Akai sampler, you get this lovely decaying grainy crunch on the reverb tail. And as a bonus for all my Shaperbox crew, I've also made this chain in Shaperbox and I've saved it in the vintage section of the library here. Something else I've done in the track is I've changed the pitch of some of the sections of vocals. So some are pitched down, some are pitched down slightly less, and it gives it that trippy burial feel. In the track, the vocal sounds like this. Okay, next let's look at drums. Legend has it that Burial used SoundForge, an audio editor, so he made his beats with no quantizing or grid, and that gave him those signature skittish, wonky, drunken rhythms. So we'll get to the drunken part later, but first let's look at the kick, which I started with. For a lo-fi style track, this kick is far too weighty and full range. Because when you drive a kick hard on cassette or tape, it gives it this really mid-rangey, thin sound. Now you could use a saturator or a tape plugin and drive it really hard, but this kick is already quite distorted. So to give this kick that lo-fi feel, I've just used an EQ. I've cut out loads of low end and I've boosted the mids and tops. It's very drastic. I wouldn't usually use an EQ like this, but it worked in this case. Then I've got this lo-fi sounding snare, and it's got this big crackle in the middle of it, which only adds to the rhythm. Together, the kick and snare play this UK garage style pattern, and for the second snare of the bar, I've dragged it off the grid here, so it plays a bit late. So going back to the drunken feel we talked about, let's look at these hi-hats, because the hi-hats are where you can really add that wooziness. So here I've got a hi-hat loop and it's been sliced up in simpler, and you can already see without me even playing, you can see how off the grid these notes are. Now you could use your DAW's humanization features to get a similar effect. Here in live you can just turn up this humanize slider. But I didn't do that in this track because I wanted to emulate the way that Burial worked in an audio editor. So one thing you can do in live is press Command or Control 2 and get rid of the visible grid. And then right click and remove Snap to Grid. And then what I did was I copied and pasted notes off the grid by ear. So here's the hat pattern I made. If I play with the metronome on, it sounds like they're having some kind of existential crisis. But when combined with the rest of the drums, it seems to work. Now, before the next tip, none of this stuff really matters if you can't finish your tracks, and that's why I'm working on some free stuff to help producers break out of the loop and finish more tracks. So if that kind of free content sounds valuable to you, sign up to my mailing list below. Okay, next up, Foley and noise. Burial's tracks are packed with sample textures that make his sonic worlds feel alive. So doors creaking, trains passing, rain, vinyl pops, all these little details. To achieve something similar, I've got this vinyl crackle noise on this channel, and there's a bit of pumping after. I've got that inside my drum group because I want that to pump and breathe with the drums, specifically the parallel compression I've got on the drums. And then I've got this Foley group, and I'm using all these different real-life sounds to make a living groove. So I've got a door closing, train noise, glass breaking, which I think is actually the sound of shells, and then this completely random noise. These pieces of real life add this emotional realism that's impossible to get with only synthetic sounds. I'll play you my living groove all together. And in the track. And this ties into Burial's sonics. So let's look at mixing. There's something really interesting about how Burial's mixes work, and not just that they're dull or lo-fi. Clearly there is an absence of high frequencies compared to modern tracks. So if I play my drums, you'll see how little high end I've got in there. But there's more to it than just throwing EQ roll-offs on everything, because the drums don't have much high end at all, and they're leaving all this space. Now, what I find especially interesting is the fact that that is leaving room for all these little pops and events to poke through from the Foley and the noise. And you can see on my Foley group, I've used EQ to boost the treble and emphasize this even more. So what's interesting is that it has this kind of ASMR effect, and it adds to the headphone experience, which is probably another reason why Burial's music is so timeless and so loved. Now let's move on to bass. I wanted to get a familiar low-end feel to Burial's tracks on Untrue. These use deep bass notes that are very similar to the classic Reese bass line. Synthesizing a basic Reese is super easy. You've got 2 detuned saw waves, a low-pass filter, and drive. But in this track, I wanted to use a sample, and notes played up and down at different pitches give that classic wavering effect. Something to note, I didn't want to completely rip off Burial in this track, I just wanted to use his techniques as inspiration. So I've gone for a bit more of a modern feel, and I've used processing to push up the Reese a bit more. And then I've accented the high notes in the riff by automating to ascend with all these effects on. So with everything together, this is my Burial inspired track. When I finally get round to releasing the track, I will send it to my mailing list first. And like I said, if you struggle to turn your ideas into full finished songs, you can get my free tips and tricks via the link below. For even more studio inspiration, check out this video up here. I'll see you there. Cheers.